So today I'm going to be talking about, as Dr. Bhatt said, work that I've been doing on modeling and mitigating air traffic delays. I should acknowledge my co-culprits or co-conspirators in this work. So part of it is going to be research that I do at MIT, and part of it is a more commercial, trying to get this to the passenger, the flying public side on the commercialization. So this is joint work with Bala Chandran, who's a co-founder of a startup that I'm involved with, and also Karthik Gopalakrishnan, who's a PhD student of mine, and Richard Jordan, who was until recently at MIT Lincoln Labs, but is now at a healthcare startup as well. Okay, so this is a little bit of just background on the system that I deal with. So air transportation, why do we care? I think it's hard to argue with the fact that air travel has become a major driver of transporting things across the world and commerce across the world. If you think about how many times does somebody get on board a plane, it happens about 7.2 billion times a year. And about a quarter of this ends up being in the US. A fair amount happens in Europe. But if you think about where the massive increase is happening, it's happening in the Middle East, in Asia, and so that's India and China in particular. And there's about, if you think about commercial traffic again, about a little under 90 million flights a year worldwide. The demand has already led to congestion again because there are delays and impacts because of for various reasons. The economic impact is fairly significant. So it's estimated that in the US, domestic flight delays have cost somewhere between $30 and $40 billion a year. A lot of this is just wasted jet fuel, but some of my work involves looking at how do we decrease the environmental impact of aviation as well. And the problem with delays is it's not just that they burn fuel, but when you're burning fuel, you're also emitting pollutants, and so we are interested in mitigating that as well. And in a system that's already strained in terms of the capacity-demand imbalance, fairly significant growth is expected, which has led to modernization efforts around the world, and these are typically referred to as next-generation air transportation systems. And it's clear now what we are likely to see in the future. There's going to be an increase in the level of autonomy, and so especially in the US and China and Europe, drones in the civilian airspace are becoming something that we want to see as a reality, and so there's going to be more autonomous decision making. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can enable this, and automation, because if you want air traffic controllers and pilots and everybody else to be making decisions, you need decision support automation in order for them to make decisions efficiently. So with this overall motivation, much of the research that I work on relates to developing controls and optimization algorithms, but really with objective of being practical. And so what do I mean by practical? Things that we can actually have a chance to implement and field test in the real world. So what do we want these algorithms to do? We want them to make the system, the air transportation system, more efficient. Of course, efficiency means different things to different people, and so this is really going to be a multi-objective problem at heart. We want it to be more robust. I will show evidence that when things happen in one part of the system because of the network nature of it, as we saw in Professor Bullo's talk yesterday, things tend to propagate through the whole system. So we want it to be a little more robust to the sort of propagating, cascading delays. And we want to do this while ensuring the safety of air travel. And really, three things make achieving these goals really hard. The first is there's a lot of uncertainty. So whether, the fog is an example where there's going to be fog in Delhi pretty much every day, but it's important for us to be able to know, in order to plan traffic efficiently, roughly when it's likely to set in and when it's likely to lift. And so and you're never going to get that deterministic forecast. So the question becomes, how do you make decisions that are good decisions in the presence of uncertainty? The second aspect is one that really, I think, over overarchingly is an issue in every infrastructure system, which is you currently have human operators. You have human air traffic controllers. You have human pilots. And it's going to be a long time before we can, if ever, automate everything. And so the question is, how do you now take into account those issues with the fact that you have to interface with humans in making these decisions? And the third is, as human beings, there is also competition. And in the air travel industry, it's between the airlines. Every airline which operates an aircraft is really interested in its own bottom line. So there's going to be a difference. There are these questions on how do you balance what is good for the system as a whole and what an individual airline wants to do because of its own selfish interests. So our approach in trying to tackle these challenges really is grounded on the increasingly available real-world data. So our idea here is let's use as much real-world data as we can, use this data to build simple, and by simple I mean physically interpretable models. And I'll come to this in a few times in this talk, but really that's because of the human operator and the human stakeholders, because you have to convince policymakers and human operators that what you're doing is the right thing and try to explain to them at a sort of intuitive level what the models are doing and what the optimization is doing. And then really what do we want to do with these models? We want to use these models to build scalable, to develop and implement scalable algorithms. And scalability is going to become a challenge, especially because there is a huge amount of demand that's projected. So in the US, and this is true in Europe as well, we expect that in the next 25 years or so, we're going to see about a 1.5 to 2, depending on how optimistic you are, increase in the amount of demand. Certainly, it's going to be demand that looks different because you're going to have more autonomous systems. But the question is, how do you now take optimization or control algorithms and scale this to have a lot more aircraft in the airspace? So ultimately, really what we want is practical algorithms and decision support for human operators. And really, if you think about what this involves, it involves the cyber elements. So a lot of computational ideas on how do you make things scalable, how do you deal with large-scale systems. There's the physical elements, which is the aircraft are physical objects. There are laws of physics that govern how they operate, and you want to embrace that as well. And then the human elements as well. So there are those three pieces that we want to bring together to make a better air transportation system. So with this background, today I'm going to focus on two particular problems that we've been dealing with. The delay issue, but at two very different levels. So the first is really a more control theoretic. I think a lot of people here, especially after Professor Bullo's talk, will appreciate the language here because it's understanding the dynamics of delays, so how delays propagate. And to do this, I'll talk about why it's a good idea or it's an effective idea to think about these as you have networks which have switching topologies and how delays propagate across this. And then the second piece of it is, so this looks at delays at a very aggregate level. And then the second is if you actually want to do something about the delays and mitigate the impacts of delays, you have to start thinking about really large-scale optimization problems. And I'll talk about how the scale of the problems that we look at here are truly massive compared to things that have been considered before, even in the air traffic realm. So to start with, on the dynamics itself, what is the problem that we're dealing with here? Delays propagate, right? So there's nothing like a good movie to explain what's going on. You might want to dim the lights in front if possible. Okay, because otherwise you may not be able to make out. So what's going to happen is you can barely make out these gray aircraft, and hopefully they'll become clearer. So this is a day when there's bad weather. There was bad weather in the Chicago area, which is here, and it's fairly localized bad weather in the morning. And so these are gray aircraft, and they're not to scale, so don't worry, they're not running into each other. And as the day progresses, we start in the morning, and as the day progresses, some of these aircraft are going to turn yellow. And so the yellow aircraft means that it has more than 15 minutes of delay. And then as some of them are going to start turning red, which means they have more than an hour of delay. Right? So as I mentioned earlier, this is where the source is. And you can see that a few of the aircraft here are beginning to, around Chicago, are beginning to turn yellow and red. But then as the day goes on, you start having, pretty much the entire system getting infected by this. You start having delays on flights between Seattle and San Francisco, because even though there was no issue, there's no fog happening there. The fog, or in this case, it is a thunderstorm, right, that's happening in the Chicago area, but you start having flights between Seattle and LA or Seattle and San Francisco being delayed an hour. So this is a classic propagation issue, and it's really because of the connectivity in the system. Aircraft is an hour late leaving Chicago, gets to Seattle an hour late, ends up maybe having about a 10-minute buffer in its schedule, and ends up leaving leaving Seattle 50 minutes late and reaching the next airport and so on. And that's just the aircraft. You then have the crews, right? So the aircraft are connecting and the crews are connecting. So it's possible that the crew was actually going to Salt Lake City and the crew didn't show up because the crew is coming in from Chicago and is not there. So you might have an aircraft, no crew. You might have the crew, you may not have the aircraft. And so this ends up being a challenge in these systems. And I'm not even going to mention the passengers, right? So nobody keeps track of what's happening to the passengers. So really the impact of passengers missing connections is significantly larger than anything that we see in this sort of data. But this sort of says to us, in terms of modeling that, hey, it's propagation on a network. So it seems like network models are the right way to think about it. And really, networks are ubiquitous, right? So there were some wonderful examples that Professor Bulo gave in his talk yesterday. So, in terms of communication networks and, transport networks and rumor propagation and, gossip propagation, all of that, they end up being a really good abstraction of these effects. However, there's a couple of things that I'd like to mention. So traditionally in network theory, there are some assumptions that are made by the models. So I've listed a few of the ones that are important in our context. The first is, if you look at epidemic propagation models, they tend to, for reasons of computational tractability, assume that the states of a node, for example, belong to a small set of discrete values. So for example, in terms of disease epidemics, they would say your population is susceptible, or it's infected, or it's recovered, or you can make it immune by vaccination and so on. But there's a set of 2 or 3 states that it can be in. The second assumption ends up being one of the network structure itself, in that they are unweighted and undirected. So by unweighted, an assumption might be that a link either exists or it doesn't, right? So it's a binary state on whether the link, 2 nodes interact or they don't. And undirected is that things are really symmetric. So a lot of the approaches that traditionally exist work really well when you have undirected networks which are symmetric. So the way node A impacts node B is the same as the way node B impacts node A. And then the third assumption is one of the network connectivity, or the topology itself, which by topology here I mean both the weights on each of the edges as well as who's connected to whom. Right? And they tend to assume that you have a static topology, and then you can see how the dynamics works in that case. Now, in our case for air traffic delays, it turns out that all 3 of these assumptions end up being really bad. So, for example, delays are really not, it's hard to say that there's discrete values of delay. You can have anything between 5 minutes of delay or 15 minutes of delay to 2 hours of delay, right? So it's or heaven forbid, 8 hours of delay or 4 hours of delay. So delays, really the state of the nodes are better modeled as continuous quantities in our dynamics. The second is that there is a lot of weighting difference in the weighting between on the edges, and the edges are also directed. In that, if I take an airport Chicago and I look at the way Chicago impacts Seattle, it's very different from the way Seattle impacts Chicago. And this has a whole lot of things underlying it. So we can go into why these interactions are asymmetric. It could be because of the kind of weather that Seattle sees versus Chicago sees. It could be because of what the airlines do there, how much they're padding their schedules, how much they care about that airport. All of that goes into those, the nature of those interactions. But the fact is, after, when you look at it, they have very asymmetric interactions between these airports. And then the third is, especially when you think about delays, because there are such temporal variations in what your demand looks like and what your schedules look like, you actually have, if you think about how airports interact with each other, these network topologies over the course of a day actually vary. They change with time. So that tells us that there is, it's nice to think of it as a network, but there's also room to actually think about broadening the scope of these models to start thinking about how can we address these kinds of networks that we care about and use that to model air traffic delays. So what does that mean? So let's suppose we think about, I want to build an air traffic delay network, right? So this is a network-centric view. One way we can do it, and the approach that we take, is our network is going to be a weighted directed network where the weight on each edge between Chicago and Boston at some time, right, some hour of the day, is going to be the median delay level of a flight that's going from Chicago to Boston at that time, right? And then similarly, the weight on the edge from Boston to Chicago is going to be the median delay level that you see for flights that are going from Boston to Chicago at that time. So this is just two snapshots at two different times. We see that, so I'm plotting, so we see that these look quite different. At this time, for example, you see this is San Francisco. You see that there's a lot more delay that seems to be going out of San Francisco, whereas at this time, there seems to be a lot more delay that's bound out of the New York area. But that gives us the rough adjacency matrix. So just to make things clearer, all I would do is if I have at some time, over this hour, there's 4 minutes of delay that's going from Chicago, ORD is O'Hare, so it's Chicago to Seattle. I'd put an edge weight of 4 there. This says that there's no delay that's going in the opposite direction at this time. On the other hand, here between Atlanta and this is Dallas, you see 5 minutes of delay coming into Atlanta from Dallas, but only a minute of delay at that hour going from, on average, going from Atlanta to Dallas. But that gives us the adjacency matrix. Again, this adjacency matrix really, this is for that snapshot in time, right? So this is going to be a function of time. So depending on the hour of the day, it can change. And these weights, Wij does not have to be equal to Wji because they're asymmetric interactions. But if you give me a snapshot for the next hour, I can build this network, right? So I can learn this I can just figure this out from the data. It's quite easy. Now, once somebody gives us a network topology saying that at this hour, this is what it looks like, or right now, this is what it looks like, we can use this to come up with a model of the dynamics under that topology, right? And it's a fairly simplistic model that we take, which is you give me an adjacency matrix, and what I'm going to say is let's suppose I'm interested in what delays look like at Chicago, so at a particular airport, and at every airport I care about what delays are coming in and what delays are going out at that time. And so our model says that if you think about inbound delays at an airport I at time t plus 1, there's going to be two things that are going to happen. One is there's persistence, because these delays are really a symptom of queues building up on at the airport, right? So there's various queues, there's various forms of congestion happening. And so nothing goes away immediately. So there's persistence that happens. So really, it's going to be some factor alpha I inbound times whatever the inbound delays were in the previous time step. So that's telling us how much the delays persist from one time to another. Plus, there's this network effect, which is how much delay is coming into my node from all the other airports that I'm connected to. And so that's going to be related to a normalized adjacency matrix. And not all delay comes in, right? Because the airlines do have buffers on different links in their schedules. And so these parameters, beta and alpha, will vary from airport to airport because the schedules are very different. Airlines have very different behaviors and prioritization at different airports. Similarly, the outbound delay at any time, at time t plus 1 is going to have some persistence from the previous time on what the outbound delays at that particular node are, plus a network effect on how much am I sending out. So those flights are gone out and they're going to other airports at that time. So there's this fairly simplistic model that I have, but the important thing to remember here is that there are these two terms, right? So one is saying how much do delays tend to persist at a given airport, inbound and outbound delays, and the second tells us how much of a network effect do you have because of what's happening at other airports. And then the state of the system that we care about is really this long vector x, which corresponds to the delay, the inbound delays and the outbound delays at every one of our nodes, right? So it's this, if you have n airports, it's going to be a 2n dimensional vector. But once we have this state, then we can write down the evolution, which says that you give me an adjacency matrix for that fixed adjacency matrix. The evolution of the system is basically that the x bar, so the state vector at time t plus 1, is going to be this big matrix, which depends on these parameters, alphas and alpha ins and alpha outs, these parameters beta ins and beta outs, and times this matrix A, this calligraphic matrix A, this whole thing multiplied by the state at the previous time. So it's a linear equation. This matrix A depends on that topology, that adjacency matrix. So it's going to be the 0. It's a block diagonal matrix with, in the off diagonal terms, there's going to be the normalized adjacency matrix and then the transpose of the normalized adjacency matrix. And it's worth pointing out that even though so far everything, we haven't assumed anything about symmetry here, this one is going to be a symmetric matrix, right? So we now have this equation. The question is, what does this mean for the dynamics, right? And it's clear that the dynamics, because this depends on this calligraphic A, depends on the network structure, because that depends on what the adjacency matrix is. We don't want to have an infinite number of these adjacency matrices, because in general it can be whatever it is, but we want to get it down to a tractable number. So which brings us to this question, can we characterize these adjacency matrices? So can we say that the network at two different times is similar, or can we say that it's very different? And there's a couple of ways we can think about this. So one is to say, let's look at the dynamics that results because of having two different adjacency matrices, and is this dynamic somewhat similar or different? So for example, what we could do is this effect of that calligraphic matrix A really looks like there's some term beta which depends on all those constants that the airlines are working on, and then times this A times x times the state vector. So really, if you think about it, the principal eigenvector or any eigenvector of this A matrix, this calligraphic A matrix, forms an invariance subspace. So one way to distinguish dynamics, so you give me two networks and you tell me, are these the same or not? Well, we could say that, you could look at the principal eigenvectors, see whether they're similar or not, and try to distinguish it, right? So that's one way of separating this. The other is to go back to more classical network theoretic properties, like centrality measures. So centrality is a funny thing, because if you think about traditional eigencentrality, it works again really well when you have undirected networks, because you want symmetry so that you can look at the eigenvalues and you end up with real eigenvalues. But here there is an alternative to this, which Kleinberg proposed in the late 90s with regard to actually looking at web pages and links between web pages for directed graphs, right? So extending the notion of eigencentrality to the case of directed graphs. And here the idea is that you don't have a single centrality measure that says how important this node is. You really need two, because every node does some pointing to other nodes and also gets pointed to by other nodes. So this sort of motivates two possible measures, right? Two centrality scores. One is called the hub score and one is called the authority score. And the idea is that you're a strong hub if you point to strong authorities. And how does a node become a strong authority? It becomes a strong authority because there are lots of important strong hubs that are pointing to it, right? So there's a cyclical definition on if I point to more important people, then I become more important. But what do I mean by more important people? They're people who point to more important people, right? So there's this reinforcement that happens. Now, a nice result that Benzi and others came up with in 2013 is if I have a network that's directed and weighted and I want to know what the Hubble authority scores are, it turns out that the Hubble authority scores are in fact the principal eigenvector given by the principal eigenvector of this matrix, which, just to remind you, is the same thing that we got here. So there's sort of two interpretations on why this Hub and authority score things might be nice. One is a network theoretic view, the other is more on the dynamics, right? But what we can then do is, given a set, if you give me over the course of a year or 2 years, the snapshot of what delays look like at every hour, I can now cluster them. I can group them into periods when the delay map, the delay network looks similar and it looked different. And so the features that I can use for the clustering, the grouping, would include not just at that instant what the inbound and outbound delays are, but also what the Hub and authority scores of each of these airports. Each airport ends up being at that time, and our delay is increasing or decreasing. So now what we have is at any time, I have a mapping between here is the closest characteristic network, right? Essentially the cluster that I belong to, or the centroid of the cluster. And then as time evolves, I'm jumping between these different topologies. So we end up with a system which has linear dynamics, but with switching network topologies. So the first thing we can do is, let's suppose we do the clustering and we can identify a set of characteristic network topologies that gives us these discrete modes, right? So I'm either in this topology or that topology. So as long as I'm in this mode 1 or under the first topology, I'm going to evolve along the linear dynamics corresponding to that. At some time, I'm going to switch to another mode. I'm going to evolve under that, switch again, and so on. And one view is if I don't know what is triggering the switching, which we're going to start by assuming I don't know what's happening. It seems like people do things, controllers take actions, the FAA does things, airlines do things, but the system switches randomly between these. We can treat it as a switched linear system with Markovian transitions. So at any time, there's a probability of my switching from one mode to another, and that gives us a Markov jump linear system model. But it's nice because we have a real system. We can learn all of these parameters from the data, and then we can see, is it a good predictor of how the system behaves? Can we validate this model or not? So just quickly what the modes look like. This is just a picture of when we do the clustering, we end up with basically 6 different pictures, but then within those 6 different networks, delays can either decrease or increase in each of them. So I'm guessing nobody can read from the back, so I'll just mention a couple of these. This, for example, would correspond to San Francisco has high delays, but the delays are increasing. This corresponds to San Francisco has high delays, but the delays are on a downward trend. This corresponds to high NAS, which is the National Airspace System, which is all of the US has high delays. I should just mention that these red lines are time periods when the median delay on those links is about 90 minutes. So it's saying that if you're a flight going from anywhere to anywhere, you're going to be delayed, on average 90 minutes, right? This is low NAS, which are low delays everywhere in the system. This tends to happen, again, because of temporal variations, mostly overnight, right? So every night, demand goes down, and then eventually by 2 a.m., you're not going to have delays, right? Fortunately, the system does reset. But what we then end up with is a Markov jump linear system model where there are different variants of this we can look at. You have some linear dynamics that we can learn from the data, which relates your state vector at time t plus 1 to the state vector at time t. You can learn these transition matrices with, say, what is the probability that I'm going to jump from one mode to another at this particular hour. And then sometimes one of the things you notice is when you actually jump from one mode to another, your delays tend to change as well. And part of this is because the FAA, the way they end up increasing delays a lot in one node will be to just ground everybody who's going there, right? So you can have these continuous state resets that can happen as well. But the good thing is we can learn this model and then we can analyze this model because you have a discrete time Markov jump linear system model. So the natural thing to start with is stability. So what do we mean by stability here? Oh, well, Stability is really a sanity check, right? The physical interpretation, namely, do delays increase or decrease over time, over the course of an entire day? And as I mentioned earlier, you know that demand goes down for about 3 hours overnight. Right? There's a time difference between San Francisco and Boston, which means that it's not quite the full 6 hours or 7 hours that you would see, but there's certainly a 3-hour period when every day demand tends to go down system-wide. So we do expect some notion of delays are going to decay and it's going to be stable. And because this is a stochastic system with Markovian jumps, there's a couple of different variants of stability that one can think of. Either mean stability, meaning that the expected value of the state is going to 0, or almost sure stability, which says that state is going to go to 0 as time tends to infinity. So days keep repeating, and eventually you're going to end up decaying, right? And we can derive for these are positive discrete time Markov jump linear systems, you can derive what stability conditions are. Now, a couple of things that we notice when we deal with these sort of switch systems. One is that some modes, by which I mean some network topologies, result in stable behavior and some don't, right? So for just a linear system for a given mode, we can decide whether it's stable or not based on the spectral radius of that particular system matrix. We see that typically the decreasing system delay modes tend to be generally stable, but at least marginally stable. And then if you're in a low delay propagation topology, then you certainly are the most stable, whereas the increasing delay modes tend to be significantly more unstable. However, it is well known that for a switch system, stability of these individual modes is neither necessary nor sufficient. So you could be switching between stable modes and become unstable. You could be switching between unstable modes and becoming stable. And what we are really interested in is in what the switch system does. So the first thing we can do is say, well, let's suppose I look at the data and I say that at any time there is some probability. So I'm going to just look empirically and say, what is the probability of transitioning from one mode to the other, right? So come up with that probability, an average transition matrix for any time of day, time of year. So then we end up with, this is just a visualization of that matrix. So we see that there is a reasonable amount of persistence in these modes. You tend to stay in the same mode for a few hours, so it's fairly strong along the diagonal, but also that you're likely to transition more from some modes to others and not at all into some other modes. But this resulting model that we have in the analysis is not mean stable. Okay, so the question is, well, that's a little bit weird because we kind of do see that the system, delays tend to decay in the system. Then we can think about what are we missing here. And this basically said that there's no temporal variation in my switches, right? Whereas in reality, if we just visualize that same matrix, but say I'm going to look at time of day, I'm just going to play this depending on time of day, we see that that matrix doesn't look exactly the same over the course of the day. Over the course of the day, in fact, there are very strong temporal patterns. You're likely to switch from one mode to another more at some times than other times. For example, airlines are likely to have a lot more service between two airports at 5 in the evening and not at 12 in the afternoon. So there's definite patterns that end up happening here. And the good news is that when we actually consider these temporal patterns, you end up finding that the resultant model, and it's just a model, right? But the analysis is what we would expect, namely it's both mean and almost surely stable. But for us, there's an important other lesson here because later we're going to we're now starting to think about controlling it. So it's apparent that what's happening is that those temporal variations in your mode transitions are stabilizing the system, which says that, okay, if you can trigger these switches in some way, you can actually be talking about controlling these systems by switching at the right time. Right? This is all data driven, so the next question is, you got to validate these. So this is just showing validation of these models. So what we do is we learn the model using the network topologies and the switching probabilities and everything else from 2011 data, and then in 2012 for every day we say, okay, what's the day going to look like, right? So we're predicting the range, and it's a probabilistic prediction because you have a stochastic model, a jump linear system model. So the first one is the total system delay at the top 35 airports. And in blue is the model, and in red is the actual mean delay that was seen in the data. And we see a fairly good match between these two, considering that we basically say that any hour of any day is one of 12 things. This is actually pretty good when you consider that you're trying to mimic what's happening over the course of a year. We do a little worse in catching the decay of delays as the day goes on. And part of the problem is we don't have enough decreasing. Delays tend to decrease in more ways than just the 6 ways that we restrict it to. This is also showing the individual nodes, because you want to make sure that your predictions are good, the model is good at the individual nodes and not just the aggregate. And so this is 4 of them, right? Atlanta, Chicago, Boston, and Newark and New Jersey. And we see that, again, there's a fairly good match in terms of what the model predicts and what is actually seen. So now that we have a model and it seems like a good abstraction and we're able to validate it, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do with this. So some of the work that we've done is it's natural to now start thinking about community detection in this sort of directed network, right? So how do you decide when airports tend to propagate delay strongly amongst themselves and not spread things out? Another aspect is finite time behavior. So yeah, it's one thing to say you're going to be stable over a long time, but as an operational person, the FAA really wants to know how many hours it's going to take. What can you tell me about the worst thing that can happen in the next 2 hours, right? So we've done some work in looking at the finite time stability of these networks as well. The third aspect, and I mentioned this earlier, which is if we know that, in fact, the system seems to naturally get stabilized because of the mode transitions, the natural thing is to say, if I can figure out what factors cause those transitions, if I can establish causal factors that trigger these mode transitions, then the natural engineering question is, can we now do optimal control of networks with switching, right? And that's what we're working on now. Something that we'd done a little earlier that is coming back here is we found that this sort of way of thinking about aggregate network, as a whole, state of the network as a whole view, really is a really good feature in predicting what individual link delays are going to look like at some time, right? And so one of the things we found was taking into account what the state of the system, just this, that centroid that I talked about of that cluster, right? Here's the mode that we're in right now, is really good at, we can predict what the average link delays are in some OD pair 6 hours from now to within 20 to 23 minutes. This is great because the FAA doesn't actually count a flight as delayed if it's under 15 minutes, and you can actually get pretty close to telling whether the flight's going to be delayed or not. And then really the holy grail of where we want to go with all of this is, this is just the delay layer of that network, right? But there is underlying traffic that's actually transporting these delays across. There's impacts on the capacity that's causing these things, and then there are flight cancellations that airlines are doing. And so part of it is how do you layer these networks and start thinking about this sort of model, but in a multi-layer network sense, and how they interact. And also different, and then the next thing is interactions between networks, because one of the things we found is that this is just a snapshot of taxi traffic in the New York area, and this is over a 1 day period, and you see that these ones. So here, this is LaGuardia Airport, this is JFK Airport, and this is Newark Airport, and this is the rest of the place. These are the 2 train stations, and so there's a strong connectivity or interaction between what's happening on the road in terms of taxi demand and what's happening in terms of air traffic delays that are happening on the airport side. And then a more rather drastic view of this is what happened in Atlanta 2 years ago in December, when Atlanta had a snowstorm, and they cleared out the airport within 2 hours. So the snowstorm set in the morning, this is 11 a.m., and the airport is pretty much, they had snow removal equipment and they cleared it out. Delta had about 5,000 flight cancellations in its network that day. And part of the reason was this is what was happening outside the airport. And they had, kids were falling asleep in school buses because there was this massive traffic jam. So if your crews can't get in, if you can't get your pilots into your airport, then in Atlanta, then it doesn't matter if you're cleaning out the snow in Atlanta on the airport side, because your flight out of Amsterdam in 6 hours is going to get canceled, right? Because the pilot couldn't get on board at this time. So the sort of interaction is really where we want to go with these abstractions. So this is work that we've been doing on a very aggregate network scale. As I said earlier, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we do at a much finer scale in actually mitigating these delay impacts, and hopefully this is what is happening on the OD pair, but here's what this flight needs, is the best thing for that particular flight. And then this results in very large scale optimization problems. So that was more a control theoretic view. This is more of an optimization view. This is motivated, again, I'm going to show a movie to motivate this. So if we think about those delays, right, it's fog that happens at an airport, fog in Delhi, or a thunderstorm in Chicago. These are really triggered by capacity constraints. So I'm going to play a movie which shows air traffic flows, so aircraft flows into the New York area, which is here, on a day when there's weather. So these cells that you see, the green is fairly bad weather, but there are oranges and yellow cells that you see which are slightly worse weather. And the white lines are a 5-minute history of those trajectories, right? So you see that the storm is north of New York, and as the storm gets closer and moves into the New York airspace itself, aircraft start getting put on holding patterns, right, all the way halfway across the country, right? So this is about, literally about 1,500 miles, right? You're talking about, and then the storm moves south of the airport, blocking these routes, and you start having holding patterns out here. So if you think about the inherent problem, if you're going to mitigate delays, it becomes a question of, if I have either, I know that there's going to be a capacity impact, or I have a probabilistic prediction that I'm going to have a capacity impact at some time, how do I now reorganize these flows? How do I balance demand and capacity effectively in a way where you don't have, people burning fuel in the air, because it's very expensive and it's not very safe and nobody likes doing it. So that really, the underlying cause of this is, there's capacity constraints at the nodes, at the airports, and then in the airspace as well. In the airports, you typically model the capacities in terms of what are known as capacity envelopes. So this is, for example, the capacity envelope for Boston under good visibility. And what this says is that when things are good, you could be doing, somewhere like 70 arrivals per hour, right? And then till about 60 departures per hour. Then beyond that, you're going to have a trade-off, because if you use your runways for departures, you can't be using it for arrivals, right? So it's a trade-off between how many departures and how many arrivals you can do. But then if your visibility goes bad, that's not your envelope. This is your envelope, right? It becomes significantly smaller. And this depends on the weather itself. And then the second aspect is a little more vague in that it's the airspace capacity itself. The airspace is divided into little chunks of airspace that are managed by an air traffic controller. And so now if you ask what is the capacity of that region of airspace, it not only depends on is there a thunderstorm cell that's in that region or not, it also depends on how many other flights is the controller dealing with, right? So really this boils down to, there is a notion of what's called a monitor alert parameter, where in terms of planning, they will say in this airspace sector, in this region of airspace, you don't want to have more than 15 aircraft. And it's going to depend on the shape of the structure, that sector, what the flows through it look like, how the controllers manage those flows, the procedures, and so on. So what we want to do is we have these constraints, and we want to manage these constraints and route everybody to use that capacity better. There are two things that actually further complicate this optimization problem. The first is the same thing that I talked about right in the beginning, namely delays propagate. There's a huge amount of connectivity in the system, right? So in the US, only about 6% of aircraft just fly one flight a day. Usually they're going from A to B, then B to C, then C to D, and so on. There are a few flights that will fly about 10 flights a day. The median is somewhere between 4 and 6, right? That's the level of number of flights a day that an aircraft does. It's similar in Europe as well. So both in, this is US and this is Europe, but you see that in both places about 40% of flight delays are caused by the previous leg, the aircraft just not showing up in time for your next leg. From the point of view of optimization and making things really scalable, this is actually, it throws a little bit of a spanner in the works in that you can't do rolling horizon optimization. You can't say this problem is really big. I can only solve 1 hour at a time, and I'm going to keep repeating it, because that sort of receding horizon control, you'll end up in the first hour of the day canceling a flight without realizing that that flight had 10 other legs and that you've implicitly canceled the 10 other legs by canceling that one flight. So this also ends up having optimality trade-offs if you do receding horizon optimization. The second aspect is that the capacity forecasts themselves are going to be uncertain in that I might know that it's going to be either this or this with some probabilistic estimate. I don't know at any time. I don't know with certainty whether it's going to be this or this. Today, what I'm going to focus on is the deterministic view of this, namely if I knew what these envelopes look like. And you can extend the same approach easily. So we'll deal with the scalability in this issue, and then you can extend this quite easily to the case of stochastic capacity constraints as well. So what is the air traffic flow management problem? This says that I have a set of flights, right? All the flights that are scheduled to operate in that day. I know which aircraft is supposed to do each of those flights, so I know what this connectivity is. And I know what the capacity at every node is going to be as a function of time. What we want to do is we want to find a 4-dimensional trajectory. So a trajectory for each aircraft through the days, right? So do this, leave this airport at this time, fly so much at this speed to the next fix or next point in the sky, then next one, keep flying like that, land, wait half an hour, get people on board, then do the same thing and to another airport and so on. And you want to find that optimal trajectory in a way that maximizes the benefit. So our objective here is going to be system-wide benefit of operating those flights, and you want to satisfy a whole bunch of operational constraints. And these constraints are a combination of those sector capacity, the capacity constraints I talked about earlier, along with flight connectivity constraints, and that you need some minimum time for people to get off and back on, and also maximum minimum transit times, right? Physics. You can't fly infinitely fast, and I can't keep you in the sky. You have a limited amount of fuel, so you can't stay up an infinite amount of delay. And there's a limited number of things we can do with aircraft. We can hold them on the ground, right? You can hold them in the air for some limited amount of time. You can have them fly a longer path, which is again airborne and it's more expensive, or if it really comes to it, you can cancel a flight. People are going to be annoyed, airlines are going to be annoyed, and it's going to be very expensive. And so the way you would do this is you have to, we solve this as a discrete time optimization problem. So you're going to take 1 minute or 5 minute intervals, and for every 1 minute, every minute I'm going to define that trajectory and say here's what you need to be doing over the next minute. And so you're going to have leave this, do this, here's the time at which you cross this, spend so much time here, then go here, and so on, all the way for the rest of the day. So the formulation of this, very quickly, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details on the actual formulation, but what you need to do is you need to maximize your objective, namely the total benefit that you get from flying the selected trajectories. Every aircraft only flies one trajectory. You got to satisfy your 2 capacity constraints. And then this is just saying here's the variable that says what trajectory you have. Now, this problem is an old one. So the first formulation was by Amedeo Odoni in 1987. So it's a very long-standing problem on how you can actually solve this. And it's known to be NP hard, right? So we're not, you know that you're looking for effective ways of solving it. You're not going to be able to do it in polynomial time, but yet in reality you want to be able to solve this very quickly. So where we end up is a very large-scale integer program, right? So in prior work, these by large scale, depending on the formulation, you'll end up with something like 200,000 constraints, right? And of the same number of variables. The way we do it, we end up with about 130,000 constraints for the same problem and about 20,000 variables, which is really what makes us be able to solve this really quickly. we can solve what's known as so the way we solve it for controls people is using what's known as dual decomposition. For operations research people, it's known as column generation, but the idea is the same. So you basically parallelize it into a bunch of subproblems for each of those aircraft using column generation. The nice thing is those subproblems we can solve very effectively because they end up being longest path problems on directed acyclic graphs. So you can essentially use dynamic programming to solve these really, really quickly. And we have some very nice heuristics on getting quick bounds on and assessing the optimality gap so that you know when you have a good solution. And as I mentioned earlier, you can solve this to the stochastic variant. This is just a pictorial version of the same thing where your master node, namely, you're not dictating what you want the airlines to do. The airlines are solving the subproblems on their own on a parallel way. And what you're doing here is you're just generating publishing prices and then iterating on those effectively. But what that allows you to do is some very nice computational results. So this work by Batsimas and others in 2011 was looking at the same problem, but on a more limited scale with about 6,700 flights, 30 airports and 145 sectors, and with a 15-minute discretization of those trajectories. They were doing 8 hours of flights in about 10 minutes. We do the full system, which is currently about 17,500 flights. All the sectors, which is like almost 400 sectors, 400 airports, the entire day in about a 5-minute discretization on essentially a MacBook Pro with 4 cores you can do in under 5 minutes. But really what I want to show is extending this to the unmanned case that I talked about, which is, we managed to fly this. This is from September 1947, right? So we're coming up on 70 years since first unmanned, unpiloted, so nobody touched the controls between the US and Europe, transatlantic flight. I should just point out that they not only saw, drone warfare, but they also said that Amazon Prime was coming. Right? But what we want to do is say, okay, now this scale of problem, if you have these guys in your airspace as well, can you now solve demand management problems for those guys? And it turns out that yes, you can, using realistic data sets that the FAA has for 2030, you end up with a system which is looking at about 77,000 flights. And this is run on AWS, so it's on a single EC2 instance with 40 cores, and you can solve manned and unmanned. So in this movie, which is going to be one of the last things I show, you're going to start having a whole bunch of red aircraft pop up, and those are unmanned flights in a few seconds. And then these blue aircraft are manned aircraft, but you're looking at 77,000 flights a day. You can solve the entire day in under 4 minutes, right? At a 1-minute trajectory fidelity. And then if you actually do rolling horizon with overlaps, you can solve it in under a minute. So that's basically, this sort of parallelization really gets us to real problems. You can include things that, you don't want unmanned systems to operate in certain regions of airspace. So there are all sorts of complications like geofencing that you can throw in here, and we solve within this as well. The real thing is what I said, efficiency means different things to different people. So there's amount of work that we've done in what is the right objective function, right? So controllers make decisions. Can you reverse engineer from their data maximum likelihood models of those utility functions? And the hope here in those objective functions is that if we have better objective functions, it's not just better prediction of what controllers or pilots or anybody else is likely to do, but it's also better optimization. And by better optimization, I mean things that they'll actually use. Because otherwise they say, there are unwritten factors that are in people's heads when they make the decisions, which make them averse to adopting decision support. And so part of the work we're doing is, can we actually build better decision support by actually reverse engineering their functions. I'm going to end by saying that there's a lot of open questions here that we're looking at in terms of, how do you do this equitably? So fairness in these systems, incentives from the point of view of airlines participating and reporting, privacy, security, and interactions not just between ground and air transportation infrastructures, but also between what you do at the strategic level hours ahead or days ahead, and tactical control, right? So the power systems analogy of this would be, your spot pricing versus your more long-term pricing schemes. So that sort of interaction problems come up here as well, and then also between humans and automation. So there's a whole bunch of other work that I'm not going to talk about in machine learning, but all in the flavor of control and optimization for air traffic systems that are really important questions, right? So I'm going to conclude by saying that really building practical algorithms can help us make the system better. We have some really good success in some aspects like airport congestion control, going into towers and implementing this. And now we're in the process of giving passengers recommendations on how to choose flights as well. And really the important thing is not just the cyber and physical elements, but bringing the human part of it in as well. So with that, I'm stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have time. Thank you.